The BRATVA'S ruin. Part 7. The ghost in Nikolai. A man can spend 20 years building a fortress around the one room he never lets anyone enter. He calls this strength. He is wrong. It is only postponement. Chapter 1. The envelope that came for him. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday, in the ordinary mail that came through the gatehouse, and Galina brought it to the study without any particular ceremony, because nothing about its exterior suggested it deserved any. Plain paper. A Moscow postmark. Nikolai's name typed rather than handwritten, which was, in itself, the first thing wrong with it. Everyone who wrote to him formally used a hand, because the world he moved through still valued the specific intimacy of penmanship as proof of seriousness. He opened it at his desk, while Sofia worked across from him on the Consolidated Entities quarterly filings, the two of them having long since settled into the comfortable, productive silence of two people who could share a room and a task without needing to fill every minute with conversation. She noticed him go still before she understood why. It was a particular stillness, not the operational kind, the one he wore like armor when a threat required immediate calculation. This was older and more total, the stillness of a man who has just been struck somewhere he believed was permanently protected. Nikolai. He didn't answer. He was looking at a single photograph that had fallen out of the envelope onto the desk, and his face had gone the color of old paper. She came around the desk. He didn't stop her. She looked down at the photograph and saw a boy, perhaps 14, perhaps 15, thin in the way of children who have not yet grown into the bodies they will eventually have, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize, industrial and gray, somewhere that looked like it could have been Yekaterinburg in the late 1990s based on the quality of the photograph itself. The boy had Nikolai's eyes. "Who is this?" she asked very quietly. He didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had a quality she had never heard from him before in 4 months of marriage, 4 months of crisis after crisis, 4 months of watching him hold an empire together with nothing but precision and will. It was the voice of a man who has just discovered that the thing he buried was never actually dead. "That is my brother," he said. "Pasha." A pause that contained an entire collapsed lifetime. "He died in 2003. I have spent 21 years making absolutely certain that no one alive remembers he existed." Chapter 2. What the letter said. Beneath the photograph, folded once, was a single sheet of paper. Sofia read it over his shoulder, because he made no move to hide it from her, which told her something significant about the particular crisis this represented. He was too thrown to manage the information the way he managed every other piece of information that touched him. "Nikolai, you have built an extraordinary life from an extraordinary lie. I wonder how your new wife, the lawyer who closes accounts and writes doors into legal documents for frightened people, would feel about the account you have never closed. The brother you let the world believe is dead, in a grave in Yekaterinburg that contains, I am told, nothing at all. I am not interested in money. I am not interested in territory. I have watched you build something genuinely remarkable out of the wreckage your uncle left you, and in another life I might have admired it. But I knew Pasha. I knew what happened to him, and I know what you did afterward, and I think it is time the truth found its way to the surface, the way truths in your world inevitably do. You have 6 days before I decide whether to tell her myself. An old friend. No signature. No name. Sofia read it twice, then looked up at Nikolai, whose face had assembled itself back into something approximating composure, though the seams of the effort showed in ways she had never seen from him before. "Tell me," she said, "everything right now." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes, the gray she had learned to read across every register of his careful, contained life, had a quality she could only describe as fear. Not fear of Merk, not fear of Tarasov, or any of the dozen threats they had navigated together across the past 4 months. Fear of her. "I need you to understand," he said slowly, "that I have never told this to another living person. Not Andrei, not Irina, no one." He paused. "I am not certain I know how to say it." "Then say it badly," she said. "Say it in pieces. Say it however it comes. I am not going anywhere, Nikolai. She took his hand across the desk, the same gesture he had used on her so many times across this terrible, extraordinary year. Whatever this is, I have already decided I want to know it. I decided that the day I asked you for the full file, this is the full file. He held her hand, he closed his eyes, and he began. Chapter 3, Pasha. My brother was born when I was 11, Nikolai said. 2 years after my mother died. My father, who had never been present even when she was alive, was entirely absent by then, off in whatever new life he'd constructed for himself, paying occasional money but giving nothing else. My uncle Dmitri took us both in, not out of love, out of obligation, and because 2 boys raised inside his household were 2 boys he could eventually use. He spoke slowly, each sentence arriving like something being extracted with great care from a place that had not been disturbed in over 2 decades. Pasha was different from me, he continued. Where I learned very young to be still and watchful and useful in the specific way Dmitri valued, he was warm, open. He laughed easily, trusted easily, loved easily. I used to think it was foolishness. I understand now it was simply a kind of courage I never had myself. He paused. I protected him. From the moment he was old enough to need protecting, I made it my single function in that house. Dmitri's organization was not gentle with its own children, and Pasha was soft in a world that punished softness specifically and efficiently. What happened to him? Sofia asked, her voice very quiet. When I was 22, Dmitri decided Pasha, 16 by then, needed to be brought into the operational side of things. A test of sorts. A delivery, simple and low risk by the standards of that world, meant to determine whether he had the stomach for what would eventually be required of him. Nikolai's jaw tightened. I argued against it. I told Dmitri he wasn't ready, that he never would be ready, that forcing this on him would either break him or get him killed. Dmitri did not listen to the objections of a 22-year-old, however senior I had become in his estimation. He stopped. Sofia waited, her hand still in his, giving him the silence he needed to find the rest of it. The delivery went wrong, he said finally. Not catastrophically, no violence, no immediate danger. But Pasha, sent into a room with men twice his age and entirely without illusions about what they did for a living, simply could not perform the specific coldness the moment required. He hesitated. He showed, visibly, exactly how frightened and unprepared he was. And in that world, in front of those men, that single moment of visible fear marked him, permanently, as someone who could never be trusted with anything that mattered. What does that mean? Marked him how? It meant Dmitri considered him a liability rather than an asset, Nikolai said. It meant the specific kind of casual cruelty that organization reserved for anyone deemed insufficiently useful began, slowly, to be directed at my brother. Not violence, not at first. Humiliation, exclusion, the particular psychological erosion of being told, repeatedly, in 100 small ways, that you are worthless to the only family structure available to you. His voice had gone very flat, the specific flatness she now recognized as his deepest grief, the register he reached for when something hurt too much to allow any other expression. I tried to shield him from it. I could not be everywhere. I could not undo, with my presence, what an entire household had decided about him. He stopped again. This time the silence stretched longer, and Sofia understood, with a dawning and terrible clarity, exactly what was coming. Chapter 4, What He Couldn't Say. Nikolai, she said gently, tell me what happened to him. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw, for the first time in 4 months of marriage, something entirely unguarded. Not the careful release of information he had decided she was ready for, not the strategic disclosure of a man who measured every word for its effect. This was simply a man, finally, after 21 years. Allowing himself to be seen in the full wreckage of something he had never let anyone witness. He was 18, Nikolai said. I had become, by then, the person Dmitri trusted with increasingly significant operations. I traveled often. I was in St. Petersburg the week it happened, managing a dispute that required my presence, and I had asked Andrei, who was younger then, newer to the organization, not yet the man you know, to watch over Pasha while I was gone. His hand, in hers, had gone very still. I am going to tell you what happened, he said, and I need you to understand that I have spent 21 years believing that the words I am about to say to you are the truest measure of who I actually am, beneath everything else, the empire, the control, the precision. I need you to hear them and decide, afterward, whether you still want what you chose in that kitchen. I already know I do, Sofia said. Say it. He breathed once, the careful, deliberate breath she had watched him take before every difficult truth across their entire history together. Pasha had been struggling for months, he said. I knew it. I saw it when I was present and I worried about it when I wasn't, and I told myself every single time that I would address it properly once whatever immediate crisis I was managing had resolved. There was always another crisis. There's always another crisis in this life. Sofia, you have learned that yourself across the past 4 months. His voice had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shake. I was in St. Petersburg for 9 days. On the 7th day, Andrei called me. He told me Pasha had locked himself in his room and would not respond. By the time I returned, by the time I physically arrived back in Moscow, having driven through the night because no flight could leave fast enough, he had been gone for 3 days. Sofia felt the floor of the moment shift beneath her, the specific gravity of what he was telling her settling into the room, with a weight that made the fire seem suddenly very far away. He took his own life, Nikolai said. The words came out finally, flat and complete, 21 years of careful avoidance collapsing into 4 words he had clearly never permitted himself to say aloud before this exact moment. In that house. While I was away managing a dispute that, in retrospect, mattered to absolutely no one and changed absolutely nothing. And my brother, the only person in that entire world who had ever loved me without calculation, died alone, believing himself worthless, because an organization I served had spent 2 years teaching him that he was. Chapter 5. What Sofia Did. She did not say anything immediately. She had learned, across 4 months and 100 crises, that there were moments that did not call for words, that required instead the simple, complete presence of a person who would not look away. She came around the desk fully now and knelt in front of his chair, taking both of his hands in hers, and she looked up at his face, at the controlled architecture finally, completely undone, at 21 years of grief held in a silence so total it had nearly become invisible even to him. And she let him see that she was not flinching from any of it. I am so sorry, she said. Nikolai, I am so deeply sorry. He looked at her, and something in his face moved, not collapse, not yet, but the visible effort of a man holding himself together by a thread he had maintained for 2 decades, and was now, for the first time, allowing someone else to witness the strain of. I built an entire grave, he said. A funeral that never happened the way it was recorded. A story that he died of an illness, quietly, privately, that the family did not wish discussed. I paid people to maintain that story for 21 years. I have never spoken his real death to a single soul, because I could not bear for anyone to know that the empire I eventually built, the control I eventually mastered, the precision I eventually became known for, all of it began in the specific failure of not being present for the one person who needed me most. It wasn't your failure, Sofia said. Nikolai, look at me. He did. What happened to Pasha was not caused by your absence for 9 days. It was caused by years of cruelty inflicted by an organization that taught a sensitive, loving boy that he was worthless. You did not build that cruelty. You fought against it for years, by your own account, with everything available to a 22-year-old with no real power of his own. You are not responsible for the architecture of an entire household's casual brutality. I should have been there. You should have been able to be everywhere, always, protecting him completely, she said. No one can do that. Not even you, Nikolai. Not even the most capable, controlled, precise man in this entire world. You are extraordinary at managing crisis. You are not capable of preventing every cruelty that exists in a household you yourself were trapped inside, fighting for survival in your own way. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes had the particular quality of a man hearing. For the first time, an absolution he had spent 21 years refusing to grant himself. I don't know how to believe that, he said quietly. You don't have to believe it today, she said. I am not asking you to forgive yourself in a single conversation for something you have carried for 21 years. I am asking you to let me carry some part of it with you, starting now instead of alone. She held his hands more firmly. That is what I am for, Nikolai. Not just the operational crises, not just the legal documents and the dissolution clauses and the careful management of threats. This too, especially this. Chapter 6, Andrei. She did not let him retreat into operational mode immediately, though she watched him try, watched the specific muscular effort of a man reaching for the familiar territory of threat assessment, because it was easier, infinitely easier, than sitting in the wreckage of what he had just revealed. We need to find out who sent this, he said, reaching for the letter again. We will, Sofia said. In a moment. First, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it rather than redirecting into the investigation. He looked at her, and something in his face acknowledged what she was doing, even as it resisted it slightly. Does Andrei know? She asked. You said he was watching Pasha. He must know at least part of what happened. Nikolai was quiet for a moment. Andrei knows the true circumstances of Pasha's death, he said. He was there. He found him. His voice caught, fractionally, on the memory. We have never spoken of it directly in 21 years, not once. He understood without being told that the official story was the only version of events I could tolerate existing, and he has protected that silence as carefully as he protects everything else that matters to me. Then he's carried this too, Sofia said. Alone the way you have for 2 decades. Nikolai looked at her, and she watched something shift in his understanding. The recognition, perhaps for the first time, that his particular method of managing unbearable grief had cost the people closest to him something significant as well. I never thought of it that way, he admitted. I think you should talk to him, Sofia said. Not today necessarily, but soon. I think the two of you have been carrying the same weight separately for 21 years, each assuming you were protecting the other by never raising it, and I think that protection has actually been a kind of mutual isolation. He absorbed this slowly. You think I should have this conversation with Andrei before we even know who sent the letter? I think you should have this conversation with Andrei regardless of who sent the letter, Sofia said. Because whoever sent it, whatever they want, the actual wound underneath it, your brother, your grief, the 21 years of silence that exists independently of any threat. And I think it's time it stopped being something you carry entirely alone. Chapter 7. The conversation 21 years overdue. She arranged it herself, quietly, asking Andrei to come to the study that evening without telling him fully why, and then she left the two men alone, because this was not a conversation that needed her presence, only her insistence that it finally occur. She did not hear what passed between them. She had not asked to. But when Nikolai came to bed that night, considerably later than usual, his face had a quality she had never seen on him before, not lighter, exactly, because grief of that magnitude did not simply lift in a single evening's conversation, but loosened, somehow, less solitary. How was it? She asked, as he sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Andrei told me, Nikolai said slowly, that he has felt guilty for 21 years. That he believed, all this time, that I blamed him, silently, permanently, for not preventing what happened while I was away. That my silence on the subject, which I had always understood as protection, he had experienced as a kind of permanent, unspoken accusation he could never address because I would never raise it. Sofia sat up. Oh, Nikolai. I told him the truth, he said, that I have never blamed him, that I blamed only myself, and that my silence was never meant to punish him, only to protect myself from having to speak of it at all. He looked at his hands in the dim light. He wept, Sofia. A man I have known for 16 years, who I have watched manage the most severe violence imaginable without visible reaction, wept like something in him had been held too tightly for too long and had finally been permitted to release. And you. He looked at her. I wept with him, he said simply. For the first time in 21 years, I actually let myself grieve my brother in the presence of another human being, instead of alone, at 3 in the morning, in the specific silence I had constructed around his memory. She reached for him, and he came into her arms, and they sat like that for a long time in the dark, the specific quality of his stillness now carrying something different than it had carried before, not the armor of control, but the simple, exhausted relief of a wound finally allowed air. Chapter 8. The Investigation. In the morning, the operational mind returned, as it inevitably would, but it returned changed, Sofia noticed, watching him work through the question of who had sent the letter, that he no longer approached it as a man protecting a secret he could not bear to have exposed. He approached it as a man whose grief, finally shared, no longer gave anyone the specific power that secrecy always grants to whoever holds it over you. Whoever sent this new Pasha, Nikola, I said, laying out what little evidence the letter and photograph provided. Not casually, the letter referenced specific knowledge of the household dynamics, the way BRATVA'S organization treated him. This is someone who was present in that world during those years. How many people would that be? Sofia asked. A small number, Nikola, I said. BRATVA'S organization at that time was not large. Perhaps a dozen senior people who would have had direct enough proximity to witness what happened to Pasha specifically. He paused. Most of them are dead now, killed in the various conflicts that occurred during my consolidation of power after BRATVA'S death, or simply aged out of relevance and passed naturally. Andrei, who had joined them this morning with the specific quiet steadiness of a man who had, the night before, set down something he had carried alone for 2 decades, offered a name. Lev Bortnik, he said. He was BRATVA'S lieutenant during those years. He survived the consolidation. He was useful enough and harmless enough by that point that I recommended against eliminating him when you took control. He's been quietly retired for 15 years, living modestly outside Yekaterinburg as far as I know. Why would he surface now? Sofia asked. After 15 years of quiet retirement, to threaten Nikolai with information he's apparently sat on for over 2 decades. Andrei was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he admitted. Unless something has changed in his circumstances, money troubles, illness, the particular desperation of an old man who realizes he has very little time left and decides, finally, to use the one piece of leverage he's held onto for insurance. Find him, Nikola, I said. Today, if possible. I want to know what he actually wants before I decide how to respond. Chapter 9. Bortnik. He was found within 2 days, exactly where Andrei had expected. A small flat outside Yekaterinburg, modest, unremarkable. The home of a man who had spent 15 years deliberately disappearing into the kind of ordinary life that drew no attention whatsoever. Nikolai went himself. Sofia insisted on accompanying him, and after a brief, serious conversation about the risks involved, he agreed, not because the risk had changed, but because he recognized, finally, that facing this particular ghost alone was exactly the pattern he had spent 21 years repeating, and he did not want to repeat it now. Lev Bortnik was 73 years old, with the specific frailty of a man whose body had begun, in earnest, the slow process of failing him. He answered the door himself, and when he saw Nikolai standing on his threshold, something in his face went through fear, resignation, and finally something that looked almost like relief, in rapid succession. I knew you would come, he said. I sent the letter expecting exactly this. Then you understand why I'm here, Nikola, said. His voice carried none of the cold fury Sofia had expected. Instead, it held something more complicated, caution, certainly, but also a kind of weary curiosity, the question of a man who genuinely wanted to understand rather than simply punish. Sit, Bortnik said. Please, both of you. I am dying, Nikolai Sokolov, and I find that dying clarifies a great many things a person spent decades avoiding. They sat in his small, modest kitchen, and Bortnik told them, slowly, what 15 years of quiet retirement and the recent diagnosis of an aggressive cancer had finally pushed him to reveal. I was in that house, he said. I watched what happened to your brother. I want you to know, I want you to understand before anything else that I tried to intervene once, quietly. I told DMITRI that the boy was suffering, that the treatment he was receiving from the others would break him eventually. DMITRI told me it was not my concern, and He stopped. His hands, folded on the table, trembled slightly. I let it go. I was afraid of DMITRI, the way everyone was afraid of him. I let a child suffer because I did not want to risk my own position by pressing the matter further. Why are you telling me this now? Nikolai asked. After 15 years of silence, after the letter, after all of it, why surface this specific guilt to me, specifically in this particular way? Bortnik looked at him for a long moment. Because I am dying, he said simply, and I have spent 21 years carrying the same secret you have carried, Nikol. The knowledge of what happened to that boy, the knowledge of my own failure to act when I had the chance. I told myself for years that my silence was loyalty, that revealing what I knew would serve no purpose except to hurt you, and you had already been hurt enough. He paused. But silence is not loyalty, Nikolai, Sokolov. I have learned that very late and very painfully. Silence is simply the thing we tell ourselves to avoid the harder work of honesty. Then why the threat? Sofia asked. If you wanted honesty, why frame it as blackmail? Why give him 6 days? Why threaten to tell me yourself? Bortnik looked at her, and something in his expression carried genuine shame. Because I am an old man who spent his entire adult life inside an organization that taught me everything could be leverage, he said. Even my own confession, even my own dying conscience. I did not know how to simply offer the truth without wrapping it in threat, because threat was the only language that world ever taught me fluently. He shook his head slowly. I am sorry for that. I should have written you a different letter. I should have simply told you I was dying and that I needed, before the end, to finally tell someone the truth about what I witnessed and what I failed to do. Chapter 10. What Nikolai I chose. Sofia watched her husband sit across from a dying man who had once watched his brother suffer and done nothing, who had then spent 15 years carrying that guilt in silence, who had finally, clumsily, desperately, wrapped a genuine confession in the only language he knew how to speak. She watched Nikolai's face move through the entire architecture of his own complicated response. The old fury at a man who had witnessed his brother's suffering and chosen self-preservation. The recognition of a guilt that mirrored his own so precisely it was almost unbearable to witness. And finally, slowly, something that looked like the same grace she had offered him 2 nights earlier in the study. What do you want from me? Nikolai asked. Now, today, not the threat in the letter, what do you actually want? Bortnik looked at his hands. Nothing, he said. I do not want money. I do not want forgiveness, though I would not refuse it if you found yourself able to offer it. I think, mostly, I wanted you to know that you were not the only person who failed your brother in that house, that an entire structure of cowardice surrounded him, and I was part of it. And I have paid for that cowardice every single day since, in ways I never told a living soul until this moment. He looked up. I am dying within months, Nikolai Sokolov. I wanted, before I go, to finally tell the truth to someone who deserved to hear it. I am sorry I told it badly, wrapped in threat instead of simple confession. That was the failure of an old man who never learned another way to speak. Nikolai was quiet for a long time. Sofia did not prompt him. This was his moment, his decision, and she understood, watching him, that whatever he chose now would matter enormously to the specific healing that had only just begun 2 nights ago in their study. I forgive you, Nikolai said finally. The words came slowly, each one weighed and deliberate, but genuine in a way that left no doubt of their sincerity. Not because what you failed to do was acceptable. It wasn't. A boy needed an adult to intervene, and you chose your own safety instead, and that choice contributed to a tragedy that has shaped the entirety of my adult life. He paused. But I understand fear, Lev Bortnik. I understand, better than almost anyone, what it costs to fail someone you should have protected, and what it costs afterward to carry that failure alone for decades rather than speaking it aloud. I cannot give you absolution for what happened to my brother, but I can release you from carrying this specific guilt toward me for whatever time you have left. Bortnik's eyes filled, and he did not try to hide it. Thank you, he said. That is more than I expected, more I think than I deserve. Perhaps, Nikolai said. But I have learned, very recently, that deciding what someone deserves is rarely as useful as simply choosing what kind of person you want to be in response to them. Chapter 11. The Drive Home. They drove back to Yekaterinburg's small private airfield in silence for a long while, the winter landscape passing the windows in its familiar gray-white monotony. And Sofia waited, as she had learned to wait across 4 months of marriage, for Nikolai to find his way to whatever he needed to say. I have spent 21 years, he said finally, believing that if anyone ever learned the truth about Pasha, they would see me differently. That the empire, the control, the precision, all of it would seem like overcompensation, the desperate construction of a man trying to outrun a single catastrophic failure. And now, Sofia asked. Now I have told you, he said, and I have told Andrei, and I have, however strangely, extended something like grace to a dying man who failed my brother in his own way. He looked at her. And I find that I do not feel diminished by any of it. I feel, for the first time in 2 decades, something closer to whole. You were never going to seem diminished to me, Sofia said. Nikolai, I married a man who spent 4 years watching me before he ever spoke to me. I married a man who runs an empire built from violence and precision and absolute control. None of that diminished you in my eyes, because I always understood, even before I knew the specifics, that whatever made you the way you are had cost you something enormous to become. She took his hand. Pasha's death didn't make you less. It explains, finally, the specific shape of the wound you've been protecting your entire adult life. And now that wound has air. Now it can actually begin to heal, instead of simply being managed in silence forever. He held her hand for the remainder of the drive, and when they finally boarded the small plane that would take them back to Moscow, he sat beside her in the configuration that had become, across 4 months, unmistakably theirs, close, present, no longer needing the careful management of distance that had once defined every interaction between them. I want to do something for him, Nikolai said, as the plane climbed above the Ural landscape. For Pasha, something real, not just the silence I've maintained for 2 decades. Tell me, Sofia said. I want to build something, he said slowly, the idea clearly forming as he spoke it aloud for the first time. Not a foundation in his name, exactly. I don't think Pasha would have wanted his suffering turned into a brand, the way the world sometimes does with grief, but something practical. A program, perhaps. Within the new structure, we're building support for young people inside organizations like the one I grew up in, who are struggling the way he struggled, who need somewhere to go that isn't simply more silence and more cruelty. That sounds exactly right, Sofia said. Exactly like the kind of thing you should build. Will you help me build it? He asked. Always, she said. That's what I'm for, Nikolai, remember. Chapter 12. The Program. Over the following weeks, the idea took shape with the same careful, comprehensive attention Sofia had brought to the whistleblower provision and the Tarasov negotiation. A formal mechanism, embedded within the consolidated entity's structure, providing genuine psychological support, exit pathways, and protection for young people inside affiliated organizations who showed signs of the specific suffering that had once consumed Pasha. They called it, after much discussion, simply the open door, a deliberate echo of the language Sofia had used months earlier when describing the whistleblower provision to Nikolai, the idea that doors, once opened, could save lives that secrecy and silence had previously condemned. Dasha, in Riga, was among the first to formally endorse the structure, having seen firsthand what years of fear and silence could do to a person trapped inside an organization with no visible exit. Irina contributed her own network of contacts, identifying 3 young people within the fractured remnants of Merck's old operation who could benefit immediately from the program's protections. And Andrei, who had carried his own silent guilt for 21 years, who had wept in Nikolai's study for the first time in 2 decades, became, at his own quiet request, the program's first counselor. A man who understood, more intimately than almost anyone, exactly what it cost to fail someone you loved, and exactly what it might mean to ensure that failure never repeated itself. I want to talk to them, Andrei told Nikolai, in the weeks after the program's formal establishment. The young people in the structure who are struggling, I want to actually talk to them the way no one talked to Pasha before it's too late. Then talk to them, Nikolai said. That is exactly what this is for. Chapter 13. The Grave. In late winter, on a day that carried the specific bitter clarity of the deepest part of the Russian cold, Nikolai and Sofia traveled to Yekaterinburg one final time. Not to see Bortnik, who had passed quietly 3 weeks earlier. His final months spent, Andrei reported, in a state of something approaching peace. But to visit a small, unremarkable grave on the outskirts of the city, marked with a name and dates that had, for 21 years, told a story that was not entirely true. Nikolai stood before it for a long time, snow gathering on his shoulders, his breath visible in the cold air. I want to change the marker, he said finally. Not the official story that protection remains necessary, for reasons that have nothing to do with shame and everything to do with the specific dangers of this world, but something here, privately, that tells the truth. He had brought, Sofia saw, a small stone, plain, unremarkable, the kind a person might find on any riverbank, and he knelt and placed it at the base of the existing marker. What does the stone mean? She asked. When we were children, he said, before everything, before Dmitri, before any of it, Pasha and I used to collect stones from the river near our mother's house. He believed, the way children believe things, that each stone held a wish, if you found it in exactly the right way and carried it carefully enough. He looked at the grave. I haven't held one of these stones in 25 years. I found this one this morning in the garden at the estate, and I knew immediately what it was for. Sofia knelt beside him in the snow, taking his hand. What's the wish? She asked gently. Nikolai was quiet for a long moment, looking at the small gray stone against the white snow, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quality she had never heard from him before, not control, not precision, simply the unguarded simplicity of grief finally permitted to speak plainly. That wherever he is, Nikolai said, he knows I finally told someone, that he knows I am no longer carrying him alone in silence like a secret too shameful to share, that he knows. His voice broke fully, for the first time she had ever witnessed. That he knows I loved him completely, and that I am sorry every single day for the 9 days I was not there. Sofia held him as he wept in the snow beside his brother's grave, the cold around them absolute, and the grief inside him finally, after 21 years, given room to move through him instead of simply being held in permanent, solitary suspension. When he had finished, he looked at her, his face raw in a way she had never seen it, and he said the only thing that seemed adequate to the moment. Thank you for asking me to tell you everything. Thank you for trusting me enough to do it, she said. Chapter 14. What came after? They flew home that evening, and the house received them with its now familiar warmth. Alina reading by the fire, Pyotr visiting for dinner, the specific accumulated texture of a family slowly, imperfectly, genuinely rebuilding itself from the wreckage of decades of secrets and silence and inherited cruelty. Sofia watched Nikolai move through the house that evening with something she could only describe as lightness, not the absence of grief, which she understood would never fully leave him, but the specific relief of a man who had finally set down a weight he had carried entirely alone for over 20 years, and discovered, in the setting down, that he had people around him willing to help him carry whatever remained. I keep thinking, he said that night as they lay together in the dark, about everything that's happened since the night you stood at your father's window watching that car idle at the gates. Merk, Zurich, your mother, Tarasov, and now this. He turned to look at her. I built a life before you around the specific principle that vulnerability was a weakness I could not afford, that every secret needed to be managed, contained, controlled, because exposure meant danger. And now I understand that the secrets I was protecting most carefully were never actually protecting me, he said. They were simply isolating me, keeping me alone with the worst things that ever happened to me, certain that sharing them would diminish me, when in fact, he paused, finding the words with the same careful deliberation she had watched him use across every significant moment of their marriage. When in fact, sharing them has been the only thing that's ever actually healed anything. That's what I've been trying to tell you since the very beginning, Sofia said softly. Since the first week in the library, when I told you I wanted the truth, not the managed version. I know, he said. It has taken me considerably longer to learn it than it took you to teach it. He kissed her forehead, the same gesture from their very first conversation in this house, months and crises and revelations ago. I love you, Sofia, not the version of you I watched for 4 years from a careful, controlled distance, the actual woman who insists on truth even when it terrifies the people closest to her, especially then. I love you too, she said. All of you, including the parts you spent 21 years certain no one could ever be permitted to see. They fell asleep in the quiet dark. The house settled around them, the fire in the library banked low, and somewhere in the structure of an empire being slowly, deliberately remade from violence into something closer to repair. A program called The Open Door continued its quiet work of finding young people drowning in silence and offering them, finally, somewhere else to go. 3 weeks later, in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, a 19-year-old named Yuri, recently extracted from the remnants of Merck's old Baltic operation through the specific mechanism of the program Nikolai and Sofia had built together, sat across from Andrei in a quiet room, and for the first time in his young life, told another person the full truth of what he had been asked to do, what he had been afraid to refuse, and what he had been certain, until 3 weeks ago, would never have an end, except the one his own despair had begun quietly planning for him. Andrei listened, fully, without judgment, with the specific patient attention of a man who understood, more intimately than he had ever told anyone except Nikolai, exactly what it cost to feel that alone. You are not going to die in this, Andrei told him. Not from this organization, not from this fear, and not from your own hand. I promise you that, and I do not make promises I cannot keep. And somewhere in the slow, patient work of building, something better from the wreckage of everything that had come before, the debt, the marriage, the war, the grief, the 21 years of silence finally broken. A single life, quietly, was saved. It would not be the last. End of Part 7. The Ghost in Nikolai, concluded. Cliffhanger, the truth about Pasha has finally surfaced, not as a weapon used against Nikolai, but as a grief finally shared, carried, and transformed into something that saves other lives. The Open Door program begins its quiet work, but the most dangerous secrets in this world rarely surface only once. As Nikolai and Sofia's life together grows more solid, more honest, more genuinely whole than either of them believed possible 4 months ago, a single question remains, unspoken but present in every room they now share with such hard-won openness. What other ghosts remain, in either of their pasts, waiting for their own moment to finally be carried into the light? Part 8 continues the story of Sofia and Nikolai as the empire they are quietly rebuilding faces its next test, and the family they have assembled from debt, obsession, grief, and choice discovers what it means to finally, fully belong to each other.